As an unprecedented amount of toxic algae blooms continue to infest Florida's coastline and waterways, many residents and business owners are demanding to know how the problem started in the first place. To answer that question, we brought in an algae blooms expert. Joining me now is Brian LaPointe, a research professor at Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanic Institute in Fort Pierce. Brian, who's to blame for the algae blooms that are taking over the Treasure Coast?
Well, Danielle, there's a lot of blame to go around. I know some people just want to blame the lake and the discharges to the St. Lucie estuary on the east coast of Florida. But the reality is the sources of nutrients and water feeding this algae bloom extend way north of Lake Okeechobee all the way up to the Orlando area. And so there are many sources of nutrients that we can point a finger at, in addition just to the agriculture around Lake Okeechobee.
You say that the reality is that it's coming from a lot of sources. Is it just one big perfect storm, or can you shift the blame on one particular source more?
Well, if you look at the population growth in Florida in recent decades, I mean, Florida is now the third most populous state in the nation. We had 105 million tourists last year, the number one tourist destination in the world. And a lot of that activity is in the greater Orlando area. That's at the very top of the watershed north of Lake Okeechobee. 90% of the water coming into the lake comes from the north. It comes down the Kissimmee Basin. You have expanding human activities, urban growth. You've got, of course, some cattle farms in that area as well. And that water comes down into Lake Okeechobee. So a lot of the focus at cleaning up the nutrient pollution feeding this bloom in Lake Okeechobee needs to focus up in that area, and also reducing the overall amount of water coming into Lake Okeechobee. We need to do more storage of water and treatment of that water before it gets into the lake. That way we protect the lake as well as the estuaries that are being fed the water from the lake.
I mean, looking back, we obviously can't really prevent people from moving to the state. Was there any way to prevent this?
Well, there are issues of inadequate infrastructure. For example, the state of Florida has far more septic tanks than the national average. This is something that's been used for on-site disposal of sewage to support rapid, cheap growth in Florida over many decades. We're now realizing that these hundreds of thousands of septic tanks that we have, for example, along Florida's Indian River Lagoon, are becoming a major source of nitrogen and phosphorus that are feeding algae blooms and contributing in a big way to what we're seeing in the St. Lucie estuary and the greater Indian River Lagoon system.
What are the costs for perhaps a better water treatment facility?
Well, obviously, if you look at the state of Florida, we're talking billions and billions of dollars statewide. The Florida Keys, for example, just sewered the entirety of the Florida Keys to abandon the septic tanks because they were a problem down there. That was about $1 billion. And I think when you look around places like the Indian River, the St. Lucie estuary, these are other areas or hotspots where we know we have too many septic tanks, and that the state legislature really needs to figure out a way to help the local governments fund septic to sewer upgrades.
Governor Rick Scott recently declared a state of emergency. Was that too little, too late?
Well, this problem certainly should have been dealt with long before now. I mean, my research and that of others has been pointing to this problem. But what it took for this to really happen this year are the unusually wet months we had this past winter and spring. It's really that rainfall that brought a lot of these nutrients, into Lake Okeechobee and beyond. But clearly, there are steps that could have been taken a long time ago to help moderate this problem.
Yeah, it's not just affecting the local economy in terms of tourism, it's affecting people's everyday lives or businesses. A lot of people are losing lots of money. Can people file a lawsuit? Is there any damages that they can collect from this?
Well, I think you very well may see lawsuits coming from groups like Earth Justice, who has been very actively involved in trying to control and moderate this problem. And in fact, in recent years, we have seen some progress made in Florida because we're seeing these issues in many parts of Florida. The amazing Florida springs in North Florida and North Central Florida, for example, have seen a proliferation of algae blooms over the past decade or so. And this has been a clear signal that even in these environments, which many consider to be just extremely pristine with this very clear water, are being impacted in many cases by sewage and septic tanks, and in other cases, fertilizers from urban and agricultural areas.
The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said it planned to reduce the amount of lake water that it sends to the St. Lucie Estuary and Caloosahatchee River. Is this an okay solution short term?
Yeah, that is a short-term solution to send less water down the C-44 canal into the St. Lucie Estuary. That is what carries not just the water, but this toxic algae from the lake down through the estuary. The problem is once that algae gets into the canal and the estuary, the local basin runoff feeds that algae bloom. And this is what I think people are responding to. They're seeing these blooms expand in the boat harbors, the marinas, their canals and tidal creeks. And it's an amazing sight to see this proliferation of this toxic green algae that you have to avoid. You don't want to come in contact with it.
Brian, moving forward, what can residents and business owners, lawmakers, what can we do to better this issue?
Well, I think you need to write your legislators and demand that actions be taken to look at this in a holistic sense and realize that we have to go to the source of the problem and not let emotion and finger pointing get in the way. This is something we all have to work together on. And I think if we can do that, if we can all agree that we need to identify all the sources of these nutrients, where they're coming from, improve the infrastructure to reduce the nutrient pollution, and store more water, I believe we can moderate and control this problem. We do have to have the political will in the legislature in Tallahassee to make this happen, and the people need to demand that.
Okay, one big group effort. Brian LaPointe, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.